At the conclusion of the trial, by the way, while we were there, remember the times, and you know, many of you in this room will remember the pro-abortion movement was really in its heyday between 1980 and 1990, late 1970s and 1983. They were at the peak of strength. Planned Parenthood had tons of money, government money, your money, still do. The so-called Abortion Rights League, NARL in the United States, CARL, all of the pro-abortion groups in Canada were well funded, unlike the pro-life movement, which receives no, to this date, provincial or federal tax money. In fact, our rates to raise money have been somewhat limited. The trial, every day for the first couple of days especially, pro-abortion activists, usually about 100 in number, were on the opposite side of the courtroom, chanting all kinds of slogans. On the sidewalk right in front of the courthouse, anywhere from 200 to 300 pro-lifers would be marching with loving signs. On the other side would be really negative, shall we say, angry signs and anger directed at the pro-life people. In those days, we in the pro-life movement did a lot of prayer. A lot of prayer. At the conclusion of the trial, Dr. Shumiacha told the many reporters crowding around him on the lawn in front of the courthouse, quote, "It doesn't matter." Before I read this quote, I should tell you, they knew they weren't going to win. This is very important. Joe, when he spoke to me, and Shumiacha, when they said, "We're not going to win this. We're not, no chance in us winning this because they're going to win on a point of law." And they did. It was referred to the Supreme Court. By the time it got there, you all know, it became a moot point because the provisions in the criminal code were struck down. So therefore, there was no point in going further because everything Joe was contesting had to do with that provision in the criminal code. So they knew, but they didn't know that was going to happen, but they knew that this would be contested and it was a point of law. This Court of Queen's Bench could not decide a point of law that was to be decided by Parliament. That point of law was, is an unborn child a person in law? They knew that the law did not define an unborn child as a person in law. The courts can't do that. Only we, Parliament, the people of Canada, can decide that. So he wanted to bring this awareness back into the public mainstream. And he did that. Anyway, here's the quote from Dr. Shumiacha. "It doesn't matter ultimately whether we win or lose here or in the Supreme Court. Now, in this year or the next year, Joe Borowski has opened the doors for the unborn child. And ultimately, it will be decided in favor of the unborn child. Just as the persons case, recognizing women as legal persons in law, giving them the right to vote, was finally decided in favor of women." And how long did that take? I don't think there's anybody that remember that. But anyway, it took a long time. Was it 1924? Something like that, when it was... Sorry? 27. This is still the quote. "The psychological and political climate was right at the time for that to have developed." That's the person's case. "And the political and psychological climate is now such that we," speaking of us Canadians, "are finally mature enough to recognize the claims of the unborn as persons, legal persons in law." And we're moving toward that every year, closer and closer. What Joe did, and it was very wise, knowing that they're not going to win on a point of law, they started bringing out expert medical witnesses, okay? Not legal witnesses. So they brought out Dr. Bernard Nathanson, who was an abortionist. He was sort of the Morgenthau of the United States. You probably know who he was. God bless him, he's become a Christian. And he's totally recanted everything he's done, and did by the time of the trial. Dr. William Liley from New Zealand, and he's the one who pioneered all that work in natural family planning. He brought out Dr. Jerome Lejeune, and I heard, I think, through Father Stefaniak, that Dr. Lejeune's cause for canonization has been introduced in Rome. So Dr. Lejeune, pray for us. And Dr. Jerome Lejeune, for those of you who may not know, is the doctor who discovered the 53rd or 54th chromosome from which we discovered Down syndrome. That when that chromosome goes wrong, then we have Down syndrome, and he discovered that. He's been decorated with all kinds of medals, God bless him. He's with the Father in heaven now, and he's probably with the unborn, laughing it up, having a good time, unlike us still struggling down here. So these were the witnesses that Joe brought out. And the reason he brought them out was, at the trial, the Toronto Star was there. I mean, I could list all the newspapers that were there, but a lot of the national Canadian press was there. Now, their reporting was something else. Now, because I was there, in other words, you're looking at an eyewitness account here, I had read the wire stories that were coming out of Regina, and I sat beside the Canadian press reporter. And you know what was funny was every day I'd come back with the CP story in the National, the Globe and Mail or some other paper, and I'd say, "What? That's not what happened." And he goes, "That's what I saw." And I thought, oh, you see, we see from where our hearts are. We see from where, if we have the eyes of God, we'll see things a certain way. But if you have the eyes of the world, you're going to see them a different way. All right. So these medical doctors were brought out to give testimony to the truth through medical science. And without going through all the medical testimony, and I'll entertain questions at the end, and I think they're all documented in different books. But the key one was, both the two big ones were Dr. Lejeune from Paris, France, and Dr. William Lively. And there were many others. And everyone to a person, including Regina doctors and obstetricians and gynecologists. And they had one truth to proclaim. That child, according to medical science, is a person, is a human being. It is not something else. Medical science has proven conclusively by 1983. Because remember what the other side was saying. They were saying it's not a human being. And so Joe was very wise. He said, let's attack that frontally to win the hearts of the Canadian people. This is a person, irrefutable medical knowledge, scientific knowledge. So I'm not going to go through all the testimony, but it always hinged on that. At the end of the day, quite often, Sir John Q would sum up and say, well, this is all really nice, and we may or may not agree with all this, but it's irrelevant, because we're not deciding the humanity of the unborn child. And so the next day we go through it and go through it. Okay, now here's what I'd like to say tonight. What happened in Regina was that God used ordinary people to accomplish an extraordinary thing. Joe was an ordinary guy. He was a hands-on, pragmatic businessman and politician. He was raising a family, trying to make ends meet, just like every one of us in the room here. Just trying to be a good guy. But throughout his life, he got confronted with all kinds of injustices. And this was the final one, I think, for Joe. When this came on his radar screen, on his heart, he realized what he had to do. He knew he couldn't challenge the pro-abortion mentality that was pervasive in Canada and the United States. And they tried that in the United States and it failed. But he knew he could challenge the validity of the criminal code because of the Charter of Rights and the provisions therein guaranteeing protection for every Canadian. This trial brought Joe into prominence like never before. But most importantly, it brought Joe Borowski into the history books. Joe could not countenance the harm done to our children, our unborn children. Now, our family magazine, from whom I mentioned I worked, and most importantly, Father Albert Lalonde, shared this with Joe and sent me to cover the trial. We happened to be on the scene, and we had to cover this. By being on the scene, we had a magazine going at the time. We didn't think there was anything in Canada going on at the time that was as important as this trial. There was no other magazine there. And we were kind of sad that none of the Catholic papers were there. I won't name them, was very disappointed that none of the Catholic papers were there, except us.